Can you all hear me okay? No. Louder. We always say my mother was a water ski instructor because you could hear her voice anywhere, so I'll try to keep it loud. Welcome. My name is Abby McGowan. I'm an associate dean here at the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm standing in for the president of the university, Tom Sullivan, who very much wanted to be here but has to be out of town. My job is to welcome you to the event. I will invite Christopher to introduce David Sanger in just a moment. But I'm delighted to welcome you here to UVM for this special event with national security correspondent and senior writer at the New York Times, David Sanger. We will tell you lots about David in a minute, but what I wanted to do was to talk for just a minute about the ongoing collaboration between UVM and the Vermont Humanities Council that makes this event possible in particular. UVM is really proud to work in partnership with the Vermont Humanities Council. Through that partnership, we have brought a series of celebrated authors to campus, including Salman Rushdie, Isabel Wilkerson, Calvin Trillin, and now Mr. Sanger. Through that partnership, we also send UVM faculty out to communities around the state to talk about research or contemporary issues. This happens through the Ideas on Tap series at Arts Riot here in Burlington, as well as through the First Wednesday series at libraries in Brattleboro, Essex Junction, Manchester, Middlebury, Montpelier, Newport, Norwich, Rutland, and St. Johnsbury. More broadly, the partnership between UVM and the Vermont Humanities Council makes common cause in bringing visibility to the humanities, demonstrating through talks like this one how the perspectives of the humanities help to illuminate the sort of key issues of our day. I'm particularly pleased that UVM is able to host tonight's talk with Mr. Sanger, which is part of the Democracy and the Informed Citizen initiative, which has been supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in partnership with the Pulitzer Prizes. This initiative seeks to deepen the public's knowledge and appreciation of the vital connection between democracy, the humanities, journalism, and an informed citizenry. These goals resonate widely here on campus among our faculty, staff, and students who are themselves working to connect journalism to a resilient democracy. Students on campus create an award-winning newspaper, The Cynic. They work on the campus radio station. They create the content for UVM TV. And then they go out to do internships at local and national media outlets. Faculty on campus are teaching courses on the politics of media, media activism, communication law, the practice of social media, environmental journalism, documentary filmmaking, and more. And the campus community has been coming together to debate and discuss and plan around journalism through special events like a 2017 special summer seminar on journalism in the post-fact age. By being here tonight, you help to make it clear that journalism matters, that the work of folks like Mr. Sanger is vital to the democracy in which we live. We need great journalism to explore broadly and to dig deeply, to tell us the stories that might be hard to make sense of on our own. We need to partner together as institutions in order to bring those stories out to audiences, big and small. And we need, as citizens, to come together to hear and discuss and reflect on these stories at events like this one. So thank you for being here, for being part of that, for being ready to explore those ideas with us. Thank you more particularly to those who have made this event possible, including Christopher and the staff at the Vermont Humanities Council, President Tom Sullivan of UVM and his staff, most notably Susan Davidson, and then UVM's own professor of political science, Lisa Holmes, who will be moderating the question and answer session after the talk. And just as a note, to facilitate that discussion, if you can write your questions out on the note cards that are in the pews and then on the seats around you, we will collect those for the Q&A session, and Lisa will help get those questions addressed. One final note, don't forget there is a book signing at the end of the event after the Q&A, so if you would like to purchase a copy of Mr. Sanger's book and come and get it signed, please stick around up here after that. And with that, I would like to hand things over to Vermont Humanities Council Executive Director Christopher Kaufman-Istrup, who will introduce our speaker, Mr. David Sanger. Thank you again for being here.
Thanks, Abby. I'd like to take a moment briefly of silent reflection in memory of reporter Jamal Khashoggi and the 44 other journalists who have lost their lives this year in pursuit of their chosen career in democracy. Thank you. My name is Christopher. I'm the new executive director of the Vermont Humanities Council, and I'm honored to be here tonight at UVM introducing New York Times national security correspondent David Sanger. As an alumni of VermontDigger.org, Vermont's investigative news organization, I'm particularly pleased to be welcoming such an esteemed colleague. Mr. Sanger's talk, as mentioned, is the keynote of 9 lectures that the Council will present this season through our Democracy and the Informed Citizen initiative that Professor McGowan mentioned. At the Council, we are often asked, why do the humanities matter in this time and in this place? And I can only respond that I believe that it is vital to our survival as a democracy and a society that we raise up these disciplines and build a deep and broad understanding of our common humanity. Mr. Sanger demonstrates the importance of investigative journalism and the spirit of inquiry as just 2 reasons why the humanities are relevant in these days of the 24-hour news cycle and policy driven by tweet. His clear-eyed prose covering complicated technical ground and his data-driven conclusions never lose sight of the humanity of his subjects, whether they are presidents and generals or electrical plant operators in far-off Ukraine. In reading Mr. Sanger's book, I am reminded that the humanities ask all of us to be curious and inquisitive, and to freely consider ideas and concepts from perspectives that are different from our own. Journalists, as humanities practitioners, ask us to seek understanding of the real-world consequences of our own actions and the actions of those who we elect to govern our nation. It is easy to get lost in the general technical gibberish of Stuxnet and Operation Olympic Games, but the threats that Mr. Sanger clearly and eloquently describes affect real people and communities around the world. His work as a journalist to shine a light on these consequences and to help us understand this shadowy new 5th domain of cyber warfare represents a real manifestation of our democracy as our founders intended. When James Madison wrote the First Amendment to the Constitution, protecting freedom of the press, he could not have anticipated the challenges of the news media in the internet age. But his First Amendment in the Bill of Rights is no less important today than in 1791, when it was ratified. Before welcoming David to the podium, I do need to offer some gratitude, so I appreciate that you bear with me. I'd like to thank our statewide underwriters, the Alma Gibbs Donchian Foundation, the Wyndham Foundation, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the Vermont Department of Libraries. I would also like to acknowledge my colleague, Allie White, who has skillfully guided the First Wednesday's lecture series from the beginning and who will retire at the end of this season. Additional support for the First Wednesday's series in Chittenden County comes from Middlebury College, Husky Injection Molding Systems, the Office of the President at UVM, Lisa Schomburg and Pat Robbins, the UVM Humanities Center, and the Vermont Council on World Affairs. Finally, I'd like to request a round of applause for our champions of democracy and the right to read, our libraries. In particular, the Brownell Library in Essex Junction, Vermont, our community partner and host this evening. Wherever you live, please support your public library. The Brownell Library will next welcome film producer Nicholas Ma on December 7th at 7 p.m., and he'll talk about his documentary about Mr. Rogers, Won't You Be My Neighbor? You might think that it will be a lighter subject than this evening's talk, but you might find yourself surprised as well. In Essex Junction, the Essex Agency, Colvard, Overton, and Wilson PC, Northfield Savings Bank, and RETN helped to support the lecture series there that this tonight is a part of. A reminder, please write your questions for Mr. Sanger on the index cards in each pew. They'll be collected at the end of the talk for a Q&A section. And without further ado, I will introduce David Sanger officially. He is a national security correspondent and a senior writer for the New York Times. In a 36-year reporting career, he has been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. Mr. Sanger writes on a wide range of diplomatic and national security issues, especially issues of nuclear proliferation, and the rise of cyber conflict among nations. In addition to The Perfect Weapon, he is also the author of The Inheritance, The World Obama Confronts and the Challenges to American Superpowers, published in 2009, and Confront and Conceal, Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power, published in 2012. For The Times, Mr. Sanger has served as Tokyo Bureau Chief, Washington Economic Correspondent, White House Correspondent during the Clinton and Bush administrations, and Chief Washington Correspondent. Mr. Sanger was a leading member of the team that investigated the causes of the Challenger disaster in 1986, which was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in National Reporting the following year. The second Pulitzer, in 1999, was awarded to a team that investigated the struggles within the Clinton administration over controlling technology exports to China. David is also a part-time Vermonter, and we need to point that out. We are lucky to have him in our state. He's been a longtime supporter of the Weston Playhouse, a Vermont Humanities Council partner and grantee, and David's involvement with the council first began in October of 2009 with a talk in Norwich. As of this evening, David has lectured in our First Wednesday program 6 times in 5 towns across Vermont. Please join me in welcoming David Sanger.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Chris, for that introduction. Thanks, Abby, for telling us about both this wonderful institution, and it's great to have all of you here, particularly in this beautiful and beautifully restored hall. It's a great thing to be able to come back to the University of Vermont. While, as Chris has pointed out, he was very kind to call me a part-time Vermonter. I think the phrase for that is flatlander. But I'm a flatlander who spends as much time as I can getting out of Washington and up here. We love Vermont. Our family's been raised here part of every year, and so it was really my great fun to go around to those different towns in your First Wednesdays program, and a particular thanks to Ali, who has always been great in trying to match up the topic matter and the right town and the right audience. So my topic tonight is how cyber has become the primary means by which states are engaging in constant low-level conflict, and our fear about what this may mean for the future of war and for the future of democracy. But before I turn explicitly to that subject, I want to dwell a bit on the state of one of our country's most treasured assets, a free and independent press, since that number that Chris described, 44 journalists killed this year, and we're only in October, is such a chilling one. And because in this particular series, Democracy and the Informed Citizen, the press plays such a critical role in the informed part of that phrase. I confess, 36 years at the New York Times brings me to the subject of a free press with considerable biases, which I will admit right up. I've been a foreign correspondent, an economic correspondent, a White House correspondent, Chief Washington correspondent, as you heard. And with each passing year, I come more firmly to the thought that there is a reason that the founders, and Madison in particular, made the First Amendment first. The Bill of Rights was not done in random order. I think the founders recognized that for all the checks and balances that they could build into our government structure, the system completely fails if the government has a monopoly on information. And that means having a constantly skeptical, constantly probing, constantly annoying, and deliberately unpopular press. Every president I have covered, and since I came back from Japan as a foreign correspondent, I covered the Clinton administration forward. Every one of them, Democrats and Republicans alike, have complained about their coverage. And if all goes well in our republic and things work out as we would best hope they would, the succeeding presidents will all complain about their coverage too. This is not a defect in the system. This is actually built into the system. We are intended, we were created to be the uncontrollable challenger, and we're created to make public things the government does not want to make public. When I hear the words illegal leaks, which you hear frequently from the president, even though many of those leaks were perfectly legal leaks, but when I hear the phrase, I know he is hoping that most Americans will recoil at the thought. In fact, when I hear the word, I understand their concern, but I also take it as a sign the system is working. Imperfectly, inefficiently, sometimes with some peril to the operation of our government, but it's working. Now, that's a different thing than saying that it should be the role of the press or the role of the New York Times to be the opposition, something that you hear frequently in current political contexts. I think it would be a huge mistake for the New York Times or CNN, where I'm a contributor, or any other major news organization to view themselves as the opposition to the government. We are, in fact, out there for a very different purpose, and that is to probe, to reveal, to explain. And I understand why frequently, if you're in power, that feels like it's the opposition. And I understand completely that people feel like some stories are wrong, because I'm sure some stories are, for all the effort we put into making them right. Now, that's all relatively normal. And if a president wants to respond by labeling stories that he doesn't like as fake news and deriding my employer as the failing New York Times, that's fine too. I'm pretty confident that over time, the truth wins out. The stories that are bad will become evident that they're bad, and the stories that are true, and our batting record so far in the past 18 months has been pretty good, will be shown to be true. I think people can come to their own conclusions about which news organizations invest in deep reporting and investigation, and who's publishing partisan spin. I know the president would like to say, as he said at a lunch once with a group of us at the Times, that Breitbart News was kind of like the New York Times. I actually don't think Breitbart's like the New York Times. We deploy people all over the world in a newsroom that spends $200 million a year trying to collect the news. That's different than what the Breitbart business model is. Anyway, we can handle all the fake news moniker stuff. We can handle the failing New York Times, although, as I once reminded the president last year when he used that line in a conversation, I said, you know, sir, we would be failing save for the good work of one man. What does bother me is the enemy of the people phrase. And that worries me because in our highly partisan world these days, that label is dangerous, both to the people around the world who are working on gathering news and disseminating opinion, and because it's intended to delegitimize the process that the founders considered so vital. I've worked in newsrooms my entire life. Only in the past 6 months have I had to go work in a newsroom that had ballistic doors installed. Only in the past few months have I had to work in a newsroom that has periodically had armed guards. That shouldn't be. That shouldn't be part of the process. We want our media to be accessible. We want our reporters to be able to get out into the world without fear of their safety. Jamal Khashoggi was not a classic reporter. He was a dissident and an opinion writer, but he was killed for expressing opinions. He was not killed for engaging in armed conflict with the Saudi government. I'm not surprised that President Trump has continued to use the phrase enemy of the people, despite warnings directly to him that it's taken as a sign by dictators around the world that they're free to target journalists. I can't tell you that it played a role, that phrase, in the decision by whoever decided to kill Khashoggi and the other 43 journalists to take the acts they did. But I can tell you that it gives good heart to those Chinese who are cracking down on what was just a few years ago, when I would go to Beijing, a relatively vibrant, if underfunded, free media. I am sure that it gives some solace to the brutal crackdowns on investigative reporters in Moscow, many of whom have met with fatal accidents or assaults. I'm sure that it's contributed to the enthusiasm in which even some democratic allies in the United States, like the Philippines, have tried to shut down government critics and news organizations. But I can tell you this, there's never been a more important time for investigative journalism, and I think Americans, or many Americans, now realize this. I think the past 18 months or 2 years has taught them that the First Amendment was not just something that they spent a day on in civics class in 10th grade. That it meant something when a White House spokesperson stood up in February of 2017 and said there were no contacts, none, between the Trump campaign and the Russians, and we have now found more than 80. Or that there have now been 5 guilty pleas and convictions, not all for activity during the campaign. Getting there has been a difficult thing. Any of you who saw the documentary on Showtime, The Fourth Estate, which was filmed in our Washington bureau as this was going on, gives you a sense, I think has a sense, of how much effort it takes day and night to not only dig these things up, but to go back and try to make sure you're right. What worries me is not that the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and others will not be able to continue this investigative journalism. We know that there are dedicated readers out there willing to go pay for this, and that's the new model in which the community pays for it. It does worry me in smaller communities, even here in Vermont, because frankly, the business model that works for the largest news organizations simply does not work in small towns and small cities across America. The place where we are paying the price the most right now is for local reporting that reveals the corrupt sewer commissioner or the decisions being made in secret about a school district. It's that kind of work where we've had to come up and find replacements. And Vermont Digger actually became one of those replacements because that kind of journalism was not happening out of the traditional old-style Vermont newspapers. But it's also important to remember that if you think about the big breaks in the past year or two, the big investigative, pardon me, searches into everything from, grab a little water here, the president's taxes to the other activities that his staff was taking in areas ranging from immigration to national security. Those breaks have come from what used to be derisively called the mainstream media. For all that we've heard about, BuzzFeed and Axios and all of these new online publications, some of which are terrific and which I read every day, they don't have the experienced investigative staff to go do what is happening now in some of the largest newsrooms. And thus, these become national treasures of our democracy. It's these same news organizations that are now turning their sights in the past few days on the Saudi government. I'm not sure that the Crown Prince really thought that the Western press would get a hold of the photographs of those people who were inside the Turkish consulate, publish them, and reveal, as we did last night, that they are a very central part a very central part, of MBS's inner circle. I don't think that the Saudis believed that this would get much publicity at all. And I think they're shocked now that they discover that moving beyond it may not be as easy as sweeping an investigation under the rug and moving on. That's only happening because you have a free and independent press that's operating outside of Saudi Arabia and that is operating with considerable resources. At the same time, we've seen this oddity. I think that we'd probably agree in this room that this press operation has become more important than ever, but if you look at the polls, there's no question that there is less trust in the press as there is in all major institutions. Partly that is a result of mistakes we've made. I think the partisan divide in the media that you see now, particularly on TV, where people go for self-reinforcing views on Fox News or MSNBC, have worsened this problem. It has made everybody think that everything is political and that nonpartisan reporting doesn't exist out there someplace. We're back to sort of where we were before the Civil War, when the press, when newspapers were divided up according to partisan belief. There was a Jeffersonian press and an anti-Jeffersonian press. There were things written about Jefferson's personal life that would make Donald Trump blush. So these are all big elements that we have to think about because somehow we need to get back to a common understanding of what Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, which is everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. We live in a world right now where people still think they're entitled to their own facts. Now, that takes me to our topic for today, because it wasn't that long ago that we viewed the internet as a huge force for spreading democracy. The more people that were connected, we thought, the more history would bend in democracy's direction. Authoritarian governments, we thought, would fall to the onslaught of openness, of transparency. I was White House correspondent at the end of the Clinton administration and through most of the Bush administration. We'd go to Beijing with Bill Clinton. He'd end up at Beida, Beijing University, and give these wonderful speeches that laid out pretty gently, since he was on Chinese soil, how the Communist Party would fall to a rising middle class that was internet connected. And I think we heard a lot of the same during the Arab Spring, only 7 years ago, when we believed that democracy was coming together because students and others were using Twitter out in the middle of Tahrir Square. In retrospect, that was a burst of what Alan Greenspan might call irrational exuberance. We've now seen a very darker side of the internet. We now understand how it can be used as an instrument of repression, as well as easily as one of freedom. We've seen how China and Russia, among others, have turned it to their purposes and used it to track and imprison dissidents, control societies, create social value scores, as the Chinese have, that help them monitor the behavior of citizens. Here in our country, we've seen the FBI and others complain that the rise of encryption and those encrypted apps on your cell phone mean that they are going dark. In fact, they're living in a golden age of surveillance, one in which your Apple Watch, your Easy Pass, the surveillance cameras that you've hooked up to your alarm system around the house, your smart TV, your Alexa, all are watching bits and elements of your day, and all of them are subpoenable. They're also hackable. Now, that's on the surveillance side of cyber. And while surveillance is a big issue, came up a lot during the Snowden time, it's not the primary focus of what I've been looking at in The Perfect Weapon, which was the book that I published just a few months ago. Surveillance is a piece, but we learned, thanks to this room, that it was only a piece. That battered file cabinet you see, which is missing a handle on the bottom drawer, is not just any junkyard file cabinet that you would find in Burlington on a Saturday afternoon at a garage sale. It is actually the filing cabinet that was in the Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee in 1972, and it lost its handle on the night of the break-in as the Watergate burglars were trying to bust out whatever was in the 4 drawers. We all remember Watergate. We all remember it brought down a president. I bet no one in the room can remember a single thing that was contained inside that file cabinet, because it was all pretty incredibly boring. It was the fact that they were going after it, not what they got, that made the difference. Now, next to it, you can see on a table there something that looks like sort of a big laptop computer. That is the server that the Democratic National Committee, now long ago moved out of the Watergate, used in 2016. It's the one the Russians got into. You hear about your information being stored on the cloud. I guess that makes you feel good that it's up in space someplace, but it's actually got to be sitting on some kind of retrievable media, and that was it. To get at that, the Russians did not need to do what the Watergate burglars did. They did not need to bust open a door. They did not need to bust open the bottom drawer of a file cabinet. But the information that was contained in it was vastly larger than anything you could fit into those 4 file cabinets. And we do actually remember what some of it was. We do actually remember, because it's still fresh in our minds, what was in John Podesta's emails, what was in those DNC emails that made it pretty clear that Bernie Sanders, who lives not too far from here, was not getting the full support internally of the Democratic National Committee because they really wanted Hillary to get the nomination. You learned a lot. But what was interesting about it was not simply that surveillance took place. That happens in every campaign. It's happened with foreign governments in campaigns before. It's that the information was then spread out around the world to achieve a political effect. And that is just one of many ways in which the cyber age has given smaller, weaker, broke nations a capability to go after their adversaries in a short-of-war way. And that's really what I'm spending most of the rest of our discussion on. So what is this like? A lot of people say, oh, cyber's the new atom bomb. It isn't. It's not an on and off switch. It doesn't kill thousands or millions of people in one blast. That's not how it operates. It is, in fact, the opposite in some ways of a nuclear weapon. It's adjustable, it's targetable, you may not even know where it's coming from, you can use it for a variety of different purposes, and some of them are non-destructive. And in that way, it becomes a much more flexible weapon than a nuclear weapon, and one that states are willing to use all the time. Now, what's that like? Analogy is a hard thing in this kind of territory, but I think the best analogy may be the Wright Brothers up there in College Park, Maryland. This photograph was taken on what is now the soccer field of the University of Maryland at College Park in 1908. In 1908 and 1909, the Wright brothers first brought out their military flyer because they thought if they were going to keep from bankruptcy, they better figure out a way to sell their invention to the US government and to the French government, interestingly enough. They initially did their tests in Washington down by the Potomac. People would take picnic baskets over, they would watch these. There was actually one awful accident that led to the first airplane fatality. It was a military officer who had flown up with the Wright brothers. They decided to move it up to College Park after President Taft came over and said he thought he might want to ride on one of these things, and they thought that might be aerodynamically challenging. So they moved the whole thing up to where there would be less of a crowd. And that's what you saw there. What was interesting about these early days of the airplane was that while everybody was talking about its utility as a transportation device and as a surveillance device, nobody actually discussed arming it in these initial tests. The general said, this is great. We'll move it up over enemy lines. The pilot will come back. He'll report where the enemy is. We'll send the cavalry out into their weak points. That changed pretty fast. By the beginning of World War II, the Germans had figured out how to arm the planes. The Red Baron was up doing his dogfights. By 1940 or 41, the Japanese were turning out these planes. I like this picture in particular because my dad, who's now 95 and spends his summers in Vermont, was the fighter director on a destroyer out in the Pacific. And he also always used to say these Japanese Zeros, you could hear them coming because they sounded like lawnmowers. By 1945, we had designed planes like this and combined it with another technology and got this. 37 years elapsed between the first showing of the military aircraft and its use to drop an atom bomb. When this happened in 1908 and 1909, no one was thinking about using it to deliver an atom bomb because the atom bomb had not been invented. I mention this because we need a little bit of humility in the cyber era. We are sort of where we were at the end of World War I right now. We know the weapons out there. It hasn't done a huge amount of damage. We're aware we're vulnerable. We have no idea what the actual deliverable weapon will look like. I keep a book on my desk that I bought in London while I was working on this called Aeroplanes in Peace and War. It was published in London in 1908, and my favorite chapter is the one that has the headline, "Could London be bombed?" They answered the question by the time the second edition of the book was out. So, if you're trying to figure out how recent this understanding of this threat is, all you have to do is go back to 2007, 11 years ago, and look at the National Threat Assessment, which is a document that the intelligence community gives to Congress every year. That document in 2007 said terrorism is the primary threat to the United States. We're only 6 years out from 9/11, that's no surprise. If you go to read the cyber section of the threat assessment, the unclassified version of this threat assessment, it's not going to take you very long. The word cyber does not appear in the 2007 threat assessment. A few weeks after that threat assessment was read to Congress, Steve Jobs showed up with the first iPhone. It's funny because when I show this, and a lot of kids are in the audience, the first thing they say is, "Oh, God, that's a really ugly old iPhone." That changed everything, because at that moment, you were not only carrying a huge amount of computing power in your pocket, you were taking computers mobile into different environments. And so the hacking became a lot easier and a lot more attractive. You now walk with your phone into your office. If you work in Washington, you may walk it into the Pentagon or into the CIA or into the State Department or into the Treasury. If it is hacked, you are bringing it in with you. And not just that, every other internet-connected device you have. So while our cybersecurity has improved in recent years, I hope you all now use two-factor authentication, with that code sent back to you by your bank so that it's clear that you are who you say you are before money is transferred around. While we're doing better at that, the reason this problem is getting worse is that we're getting wildly more devices connected to the internet. Think about your own house. In 2007, you had maybe one or two things connected to the internet, a computer or maybe a laptop computer. Today, you've got you know, your Alexa, your smart TV, your internet-connected refrigerator. I've never quite figured out what I was supposed to do with an internet-connected refrigerator. I guess if it told me to eat less, that would be useful. But you've got all these devices, and you have to think of each one of them as increasing exponentially the attack surface for ordinary criminals, but also for states, if they are thinking about how to get at government data, corporate data, whatever. We're now aware of this. For the past 5 years, the number one threat in that threat assessment has been cyber. Ahead of terrorism, ahead of nuclear proliferation, ahead of North Korea, ahead of Iran. It's been the number one. But not necessarily the number one in the way that you would worry about, the cyber Pearl Harbor that you heard politicians talking about that would turn off all the power from Burlington down to Washington, D.C. Yes, that's a big worry, but it's also a deterrable worry. If a foreign power came along and did that, assuming we could figure out the attribution, who it is did it, the likelihood is they would be visited by, you know, some B-52s at some point. It's the much more subtle uses of power. As Clapper said, James Clapper said, we must be prepared for a large Armageddon-style strike that would debilitate the entire infrastructure, but that's not the most likely scenario. Instead, the most likely scenario comes in other much more subtle forms in which Russia and China and Iran and North Korea are, of course, our biggest worries, but hardly our only worries. And that's what we don't have a concept for deterring yet. It took years to get to mutually assured destruction as the concept for deterrence for nuclear weapons. We're still in that era where we're trying to go figure this out. So how is cyber used? I mentioned espionage, but there are these three other areas. There's the manipulation of data, and that could be the voting machine that you're worried about, but it could also be somebody getting into the military's databases and changing the blood type of every soldier. You could imagine the havoc that could be wrought by that. It could be getting into financial records. You could imagine the havoc caused by that. It could be getting into redirecting every traffic light, or phone conversations, or text messages. All of those things that would undercut your confidence in the systems we've built up that guide your everyday life. There are hacks for destructive purposes, and that means doing via cyber what previously you could only do by sending in saboteurs or bombing a site. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's hacking for political goals. So in the espionage world, on the left side, you see the F-35, the most expensive fighter jet you have ever paid for. Many of them are grounded right now, but that's a separate issue. On the right is the Chinese version. If they look very similar, it's because the Chinese about 10 years ago got into the databases of the military contractors who were building it, and they've designed a perfectly good, efficient, not quite as high-tech, but far less expensive version, as you would expect. Then comes the destructive purposes. This is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. You will remember him as the former president of Iran. In this case, he's walking through the centrifuge hall in Natanz, which is, of course, where Iran enriched its uranium until the 2015 nuclear agreement came along. That photograph turned out to be vitally important to American intelligence agencies because if you look at the piping at the top, it showed how these centrifuges are connected. And while this is not a physics lecture designed by the physics department here at the university, I can tell you that each one of these silvery devices you see, a centrifuge, has a core that is spinning, a thin steel tube, spinning at supersonic speeds, and as it spins, the heavier elements of uranium fall to the bottom, the lighter ones go to the top and get siphoned off, and as this circulates from one machine to the next, you get purer and purer nuclear fuel. If you hit 4% of enrichment, you have something you can use in nuclear power plants. If you just keep the machines running and you get to 90% enrichment, you have what you can use in a nuclear weapon. And that's why this is such a difficult technology to control, because every country can say, we're just doing what you're doing. We're just making fuel for our domestic energy needs, which is protected under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the rules of the International Atomic Energy Agency, as long as it's all regularly inspected. President Bush realized that he needed to come up with a way to slow this process down, and one day a group of generals and intelligence officers showed up in the Oval Office and they said, "Sir, we think we have a way. These machines are connected to computers. They're walled off from the internet, right? There's an air gap, so they're not connected. You can't just go onto the World Wide Web and find yourself plugged into the Natanz nuclear plant. But if we can get through that air gap, as they thought they could, and we can get the right code into the computers, we can make these things spin faster or slow down until they become wobbly like a top and make them blow up. And the Iranians will not know whether they are blowing up because they were badly manufactured or for some other reason. Well, President Bush didn't really believe this would work, but he authorized them to go experiment. They went down to Tennessee. They took some of these centrifuges that had been turned over by Muammar Gaddafi. Thank you, Mr. Gaddafi. When he was giving up his nuclear program, they built a facility under a hillside secretly to test out, try to replicate the Natanz plant. They began to write the code. They made the things blow up. They took the shards from a few of them. They flew them to Washington, drove in the West Wing of the White House, dumped them out in the Situation Room, conference table, invited President Bush down to see them, and President Bush looked at it and said, well, I won't tell you what he said because it wouldn't be the kind of polite language we want to use at the University of Vermont and the Vermont Humanities Council, but it's George Bush, you can imagine what he said. Began with O. Okay. And at that point, they began to do these attacks inside Iran, patiently getting inside the system. Fortunately, Iran kept calling out to the German manufacturers of the computer controllers for periodic repair, and magically, the code got inside the computer systems even though it wasn't connected to the internet. I don't know how that happened. You can read in the book how it happened. Eventually, somebody made a mistake. This was a joint US-Israeli operation. The Israelis got a little aggressive. They wrote some code without testing it fully. It got out. You all heard about it in the summer of 2010 as Stuxnet. It was code that people were trying to figure out. We dug pretty deeply into it for 14 months. This is why you spend a lot of money on investigative reporting. We flew around the world. We had experts look at the code and the signatures that it left. I discovered along the way that the code only operated against machines organized in groups of 164. When a computer programmer who knew nothing about the Iranian nuclear program mentioned that to me, the light bulb went off because I said to him, you know the Iranians organized their centrifuges in groups of 164. And that was the moment in which we understood what this weapon was designed to do. I wish I could say that was a brilliant insight. It wasn't, but it comes from the fact that the New York Times had invested in me and a few of my colleagues delving deeply into the operations of the Iranian nuclear program for a decade. And that's when you get to put those kind of connections together. That was the story that resulted from it. It was an excerpt from an earlier book called Confront and Conceal. It led to a 4-year-long leak investigation by the FBI, which fortunately I'm glad to say is over. It was run by Rod Rosenstein, name you've heard since, and it ended up prosecuting one general for lying to the FBI and nobody for the actual leak, and that's because the information was pieced together all around the world. And everybody in Washington thinks that you go off into a parking lot somewhere and someone whispers to you the deep, dark secret. 36 years, not one parking lot conversation that has resulted in a news story. But there you go. We are now in a post-Stuxnet world. We're after this code. And it was a world that was predicted by President Obama, who approved the continuation of the Stuxnet attacks. You won't read about it in his memoir because the U.S. has never admitted to it and never declassified any of this. But he worried at the time that if the U.S. gets caught doing this, other countries will be doing this as well. And in fact, other countries that were planning to do cyber attacks anyway used Stuxnet as their excuse to step it up. So the Saudi Aramco facility was attacked by Iran, 30,000 computers melted down. The North Koreans attacked South Korean banks and media organizations in an operation called Dark Soul. The Russians went after the State Department, the White House, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And you probably never heard about it because the Obama administration never called them out on it in public, thinking this is just espionage. And so if you're Vladimir Putin and you're thinking nobody cares about fighting their way out of the White House, who's going to care about whether or not there were attacks on the Democratic National Committee, which was, of course, just basically staffed by college kids. No offense here to college kids. The Sands Casino was attacked. They really know how to hurt a country. I mean, when you go after the casinos in Las Vegas, I mean, really. Why? Because Sheldon Adelson owns the Sands Casino and suggested one day at a university in a talk he was giving that the way to teach the Iranians a lesson was to explode a nuclear weapon in the desert and tell them Tehran is next. 3 months later, his workers came into the Sands Casino, turned on the casino computer systems, and discovered that the entire hard drive systems had been wiped clean. Funny that. They spent the next few months trying to keep us from finding out about it. They failed, I'm pleased to say. There's a German steel mill that had the same problem, done by the Russians. There's Sony, which we'll get to in the Office of Personnel Management. Sony's a great one. Anybody here see this movie, The Interview? Okay. A few people in the back have done this. For the rest of you, I can now save you 2 hours of your life by telling you that it's a really terrible movie, but you guys can disagree with me later on. It's a comedy, Seth Rogen and James Franco. The pretense is that they're sent off to go interview Kim Jong-un, and they assassinate him on the way out with a CIA-devised bomb. The North Koreans heard about this and did what any country would do if they wanted to stop a movie from coming out. They wrote a letter to the Secretary General of the UN demanding that he stop it. We all know what deep influence the Secretary General has in Hollywood. When that didn't work, they sent a team out to actually go off and try to get inside Sony's computers and show them that North Korea wasn't going to put up with this. And that's essentially what they did. They mapped the computer system the same way the US had mapped the Iranian system. They patiently waited for months. During that time, James Clapper, who was the Director of National Intelligence under President Obama, actually went to North Korea to win the freedom of an American who was being held hostage. He got the American back. Along the way, he met this North Korean general who ran the Reconnaissance General Bureau, which is sort of the closest thing North Korea has to a CIA. If that guy looks familiar, it's because he showed up not in uniform, but in suit and tie in the Oval Office a few months ago with that giant envelope inviting President Trump to the Singapore. It looked, I know, like an ad for the for one of those magazine contests, right? That you had just won. But this guy who ran the Reconnaissance General Bureau was directing the Sony hack when Clapper was there in North Korea. General Clapper told me when I interviewed him for this book that he had no idea what was going on. And he said, why would we? we don't look at the private networks of American companies. We're not allowed to by law. So it's not as if we had the radar off the way we did at Pearl Harbor. It's that we had never even built the radar for this. It took just a few minutes for the North Koreans to do their damage, just around Thanksgiving in 2014. If you went into Sony and you were an employee that day, you turned on your computer, this is what you saw on the screen. All this stuff on the bottom was just intended to keep you distracted for the few seconds it would take for the North Koreans to wipe your hard drive out. The people who were smartest inside the company reached behind their computers and unplugged the computers, which stopped the hard drives from turning. They're the only ones who saved any data. Sony ended up turning out their paychecks that week and the following weeks by going down in the basement and finding those old paycheck machines from the 70s and sort of printing them out one by one. The North Koreans did something else. They released in public the emails they had stolen. Well before the Russians ever did this from the Democratic National Committee. It was like the canary in the mine, right? From this, we learned, the deeply important news that Angelina Jolie can be hard to work with on the set. But it was the technique that was an important thing to understand. And the White House didn't even know how they would go respond. Was this an act of vandalism, as President Obama first said? Was it an act of sabotage? Was it cyber war, as some said? So they had to go brief the president. These are not the guys who briefed the president. These are from the movie, okay? But I did find the briefers for the president, and I drained them out about what they said. And they said that the president said, the briefer said, "I never thought I'd be here briefing on a bad Seth Rogen movie, sir." Obama said, "How do you know it's a bad movie?" He said, "Sir, it's a Seth Rogen movie." I did this out in Aspen this summer, and the next thing you know, I look on my Twitter feed and there's a tweet from Seth Rogen saying, "Sanger, he's just a hater," So President Obama did act against the North Koreans after claiming that the problem here was that they were engaging in an act to limit people's First Amendment ability. That can turn out a movie. They were trying to suppress a movie and keep people from coming to it. So he went after the constitutional, very American issue, not after the fact that they had gotten into a computer system of a private American company. And this is what he said. And in the end, they put a few sanctions on the North Koreans that I doubt the North Koreans ever felt among all the other sanctions we have on North Korea. And they got the Chinese to turn off their internet service for a day or two to send a message. But fundamentally, the North Koreans went unpunished and others noticed. At the same time, the Office of Personnel Management, the most boring bureaucracy in Washington, which is saying a lot, was being hacked by the Chinese, who spent a year inside their systems draining out all the records of everybody who had ever sought a security clearance in the United States government. And to do that, you have to fill out this enormously long document called an SF-86. This is not just your name and your social security number and your address. It's your medical history, your financial history, your kids' history, the name of every foreigner you ever met, information about your spouse, information about everybody you've had a relationship with who is not your spouse. You can imagine the sensitivity of this data. What did the US government do with this data? Well, not what the Pentagon and the CIA do with their stuff, which is pretty well locked up. OPM, because nobody was paying attention to it, put it in the computer systems of the Department of the Interior, where it got all the same protections that, say, buffalo migration in Yellowstone gets. So the Chinese went in and were taking it out within hours. Also, the US government left all this data about all of you unencrypted, because it's hard to search the data when it's encrypted. What did the Chinese do? They encrypted it on the way out so that we wouldn't see that they had just stolen it. What did we do after they sent a bunch of people from OPM out to explain to me and my colleagues that it made sense not to encrypt it? They quietly put a notice in the Federal Register for a contract to encrypt all of their data. Somebody sent this to me. I wrote a little story about it. I said, why don't we give the contract to the Chinese? They've already done all the work. General counsel at OPM did not think that was as funny as I did. So the big question is, was this a cyber attack? Interestingly, the intelligence community said it was not. Why not? Because it was merely espionage. And if we called this a cyber attack, then everything we do is a cyber attack. And everybody knows we don't do cyber attacks, at least not illegal ones. So we're into this definitional game that becomes very important when we get to the Russia hack. Because when you look at what the Russians turned out, they were ads like this. This was not explicitly about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. It was an ad to try to go at the schism in U.S. society about Black Lives Matter. It was just to go take our existing divisions and widen them. Now, on occasion, they were specific about candidates. This was my favorite out of this. You know, not subtle, those guys at the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. My family, a lot of my family's from Texas, so I always show this one. This was to go promote the Texas secession movement, which has got more than a few adherents in Texas. A few of them might be in my family. We might not invite them to every Thanksgiving. Okay, so if friends of ours put any of these up on Facebook, it would be perfectly legal. It would be within your First Amendment rights. The question is, in a society where we preserve that and cherish that ability, what do you do when a government puts them up to try to influence an election? You're not going to be able to ban all of these because you're not going to know for sure whether they were put up by an individual who happens to believe in Texas secession, could be an aunt and uncle of mine, right? Or whether or not it was put up by a government, in which case it would violate Facebook's terms of service, and they could go out and do this. And this is why Facebook has tied itself up in knots and made so many mistakes along the way in the past 2 years, one of many reasons that they have. What's the solution to this? Well, Facebook is now beginning to say that they are going to report to you, if it's a politically oriented advertisement, where they think it came from. It would be helpful to know that this didn't come from your cousin in Dallas, but instead was designed in St. Petersburg. That would be St. Petersburg, Russia, not Florida, right? If you saw that, you might be a little more aware. They're also trying to make sure that it wasn't written by bots. One of their rules is you've got to be a human being doing this. You can't have bots spreading it around. But this is not going to be a total solution, not by a long shot. And it's not going to get at these destructive uses of cyber that we've described. Nor will treaties, because in the old days of the nuclear world, there were only 9 countries that had nuclear weapons and only 2 we were worried about, Russia and China. And you could go into a big cave in Colorado and see where the attack was coming from. And we had missile defenses around, which might work half the time. But we were able in the end to reach some treaties and reduce drastically the number of weapons. That's not going to work in the cyber world. There are governments that use cyber, there are criminals that use cyber, there are terrorists that use cyber, there are teenagers that use cyber. My experience is teenagers really don't sign treaties, at least the ones that grew up in our house. So we're going to begin to need some rules of the road where we agree that some things are off limits. And if we all sat down over a beer, one of those great Burlington craft beers, and tried to put together a list of what those would be, we'd probably come up with things like the electric power grid, hospitals, nursing homes, maybe the election system. But I keep trying this out on my friends in Washington. I said, supposing the Secretary of State sent a note around and said, hey, everyone, in a few weeks, we're going to start up a negotiation to set up some standards of what's off limits. which means all of you are going to have to agree that these are off limits for American attacks around the world. Here's my list. Anybody have any objections? I'm guessing that within 24 hours, there's a meeting in the Situation Room in which the intelligence community comes out and says, turn off all the electric power would be a no-go. Do you guys remember Nitro Zeus? It's in Sanger's book. It was our plan to turn off all of the electric power in Iran if we got into a broader conflict with them that was avoided by the 2015 nuclear agreement, which I hear has run into some trouble. Stop people from attacking emergency communication systems. As soon as you bring down the power, you bring down the emergency communication systems, and people's batteries aren't going to last forever. Elections. Yeah, I know we hate what Putin did, but you may remember that the US meddled in the Italian election in 1948, more Latin American elections than we can count in the 50s and 60s. We staged a coup in Iran in 1954. We're paying the price for that to this day. We don't remember it, the Iranians do. Japan, South Korea, we meddled in those elections to make sure that the communists didn't win. We weren't using cyber means. Would you want to take away from the President of the United States the ability to go manipulate an election someplace if he thought the person who was likely to get elected would go to war with the US? Wouldn't you rather that they have the tool around to avoid the war? So I think one of the biggest impediments to setting these kind of norms around the world is going to be us. Which takes me to my last point. We have wrapped so much secrecy around cyber, more than we wrapped around our nuclear programs, that we're not debating these because the US government will not talk about its cyber capabilities. It spends billions of dollars on it. We now have the US Cyber Command, one of the largest commands, new big commands in the US military. They sit right next to the National Security Agency, which has done this on a civilian basis and is an intelligence agency for many years. But we don't get out and discuss it in public. Even in the nuclear age, we talked about how many nuclear weapons we had, roughly. We talked about how we might use them. We kept the technical details quiet. But we had a big debate about how to use them. And at the end of that debate, we ended up in an entirely different place than we began. We nearly used them in Korea and Vietnam. We ended up concluding we would never really use them except for national survival. We haven't even begun that discussion in public concerning cyber. It's one of the reasons that all of us at the New York Times and my colleagues elsewhere and in books and on TV and so forth are describing these kinds of programs, classified as they may be, because if we don't, people are not going to understand what kind of choices are out ahead of them. So I thank you for coming. I look forward to your questions, and I really appreciate your being here tonight on a lovely Vermont evening when you could have been walking out by the lake. So thanks so much, and thanks for having me back to the university.
Can you hear me? Okay, well, thank you to David Sanger for this compelling and very timely talk. I would like to remind members of the audience to please write your questions and circulate them around as they come in. I will be happy to ask them of Mr. Sanger. As those questions are coming in, though, I have a few questions of my own that I will start with. You mentioned, and Chris did as well in his opening comments, Jamal Khashoggi. And I wanted to ask you about a piece that you published yesterday, thank you, where you quoted a former Obama White House aide on nuclear issues as saying, I think they, I believe meaning President Trump and the Saudis, have a very strong incentive to cook up some story that will get us out of this fix. And in your piece, you tie together the Trump administration's reaction to the disappearance of Khashoggi with his approach to Iran. I wonder if you would like to make some comments about that.
No, thanks, Abby, for that. In the next 3 weeks, the Trump administration plans to go put into effect their next level of sanctions against Iran after the withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear agreement. And those are intended to cut off the last of Iran's oil revenues. I don't think it'll work to do that completely, but they've already cut off a good number. If you're going to do that without sending oil prices spiking, someone's got to make up for the Iranian oil production. And that someone is the Saudis. Producing it in the same neighborhood, all flows into the same global market. So what's really going on here? At the moment, we have many in Congress talking about sanctioning the Saudis for whatever role the royal family may or may not have had in Mr. Khashoggi's death and murder. We're actually about to go enrich the Saudis a good deal by sending the Iran oil business to them in our effort to go make sure that we've contained the Iranians. And that's the essence of what's happening. We're talking about sanctions at a moment that we need them for this diplomatic effort. You may approve or disapprove of the diplomatic effort, but that's where we're headed.
Okay, I'm going to move on to one of the questions from someone in the audience. In your book and in your presentation, you talked about the issue of secrecy in the cyber area. Is there a compelling reason, though, for the government to stay mum about cyber capabilities? Are they trying to avoid spreading hysteria, for example?
They're trying to avoid people understanding what our capability is, because as in all military programs, they try to make sure that your adversary doesn't understand both your offensive and your defensive techniques. In the case of cyber, it's one of the first weapons that's been developed by the intelligence agencies, and it turns out the intelligence agencies are naturally secretive. Big surprise. But in this case, I actually think the secrecy is working against them, because by not discussing it, you're losing the deterrent effect of saying to a country, if you mess with us in some certain ways, you're going to pay a price. More importantly, you're preventing that discussion about what it is we won't use cyber for. And there are many, as you can imagine, who don't want that conversation to happen. And the way to shut it down the best is to say, I'd love to debate it with you, but it's all deeply classified. The fact of the matter is, as you can tell from this presentation, we know a lot about what others are doing to us and a bit about what we're doing to others. And there's lots more on that, as you'll see in The Perfect Weapon. But you can't have a discussion about what your policy should be until you've actually debated what it is you are capable of doing and what you are willing to do.
Okay. I have a few questions that relate to whether particular technologies or lack thereof provide any hope for helping to avoid this problem or contain it at least to some extent. So I'll start with a question that asks, does blockchain hold any hope for securing cyber communications and data veracity?
So blockchain does, and I could explain to you a little bit about how blockchain works, but those of you who know it well would be revealing my ignorance, and those who don't would walk away as confused as you are today. But basically, it is a way of having all users verify a set of transactions. It may be helpful in doing that, but it's a slower process, and number one. And number two, I'm not sure it's useful for the kind of everyday communications we have. Quantum computing is another one that people say will, be useful for this. It will also be useful for foreign powers that want to break our encryption and maybe break blockchain.
Now, from the other side of the technological spectrum, I have a question that asks, if a homeowner has no internet connections in his or her home, no smart TV, etc., is that person better off than his or her neighbor who is so equipped? So I guess the premise of this question is, should we all try to pull back from technology here?
This is a question you would only get in Vermont. And Montana. Yes, if you want to solve this problem, build a log cabin, don't make it dependent on the electric grid, no internet connection, No USB drive that somebody comes in and infects anything with. Won't make any difference if you don't have any electricity. Certainly no cell phone. In fact, no phone whatever. You'll get a lot of reading done. You're going to miss the Red Sox in the World Series, I'm sorry to say. Yes, you'll be safe, but you'll also have just cut yourself off from the modern world. Now, I have a few neighbors down in our town in Vermont who I think already live like that, but I'm not sure you necessarily want to. To the question of, are you living better? That's a value judgment that I don't think this reporter is ready to go make. Yeah.
Okay. So I also have a couple of questions that focus on different aspects of a broader, sort of more national approach to this issue. One focuses on, it was relatively easy to get the public worried about nuclear threats because we all could die. In an era of constant data breaches and hacking, how do we get the public to understand the gravity of these cyber threats?
So it's an excellent question, because one of the reasons that the response has been so low is twofold. One, we haven't had that big Pearl Harbor one, right? There are a lot of people who think we're not going to do what we have to do until we've had a cyber attack so big that it forces action. But as I hope you walked away from my presentation with, it's actually not the big attack that worries me. It's those data manipulation, subtle attacks, whether they're information operations or whether it's that change in the blood type thing that I mentioned. The second element of that question about why it is we are not all more revved up about it is that we have all become inured in some ways to every little breach. You pick up the paper, you learn, the people who do your health care have been breached, your bank's been breached, your Target card's been breached. At some point you say, there's not a hell of a lot I can go do about this. And for some of it, you don't really need to worry about it. Your credit cards are an example. The credit card companies are going to absorb the loss if somebody goes out and buys on Amazon on your card, right? So do you need to sit around and worry about it? No. Are there some basic things that you can do? Yeah, we talked about some of those before. But remember, those basic things are the equivalent of putting locks on your doors, which of course no one in Vermont really uses, or having an alarm system in your house. It's going to help you get rid of the sort of drive-by common criminals. It's not going to help you if you are the collateral damage in a state-on-state war going on 30,000 feet above your head. Just as your alarm system isn't going to help you if an ICBM shows up in the skies over Burlington. So you've got to sort out the state problem from the sort of common criminal problem.
So in your book, I would like to provide a follow-up question for this. In your book and in your presentation, you mentioned things like signing up for two-factor authentication, locking up home network Wi-Fi routers, and improving awareness of phishing schemes, that those things can, quote, to quote your book, help to wipe out 80% or more of the daily threat.
Right.
And on one level, for a problem that seems so overwhelming and that has all of these names to it that can be confusing and hard to wrap your head around, that seems almost charmingly low tech. But I wonder, to kind of build on the previous question, are you suggesting what that made me think of was a return to a World War II era ad campaign for victory gardens or the like? Don't pick up that thumb drive in the parking lot.
I've never thought of the World War II part of it, but I have thought of, sort of the safe sex campaigns you've seen in the schools, okay? It's a little bit more like that. It's here are the basic things you got to go do, okay? So people get that, and you know what? That worked. Teenage pregnancy actually came down, right? So there are some good models out there. Another model, countering terrorism. Much better model than nuclear for these kinds of things. Yes, it's a pain in the neck every time we go through the airport that we're taking off our shoes and taking everything out of our pockets and all that, but we all put up with it because we know that this is going to get rid of 99% of the air threats that we have, right? That doesn't mean it's going to be perfect, There are going to still be things that happen, but we put up with it. That's sort of where we have to get to in cyber. But you can't have you're not going to design technology to completely solve this problem. Just as missile defense didn't solve our incoming ICBM problem. We had to come to some political agreements about what it is we were and weren't going to do, and what kind of weapons we were and weren't going to have. And in the future, what kind of capability artificial intelligence will and will not have, because that will speed up all of this process.
So another question takes as its premise, the vast majority of humans will always favor security and safety over any other choice. And then the question that follows from this is, how do we keep from becoming a police society, a police state, presumably through technology or on the internet?
Well, first of all, I don't agree with the premise that 90% of humans will do that, because if that was the case, no one would ever text and drive at the same time, right? And yet we know it happens. So the police state one is an important question, because even if our country, even if the nation does not go out to try to do the kind of controls that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have done, we create in the digital dust that we leave every day something that could be tapped into or subpoenaed, right? I was talking a few months ago at a book presentation I gave to a lawyer who turns out handles a lot of divorce cases. What's the first thing he subpoenas? The phone records, not for who anybody called, but for that geolocational data that's in your phone and in your car that might raise the interesting question of why your car was parked in front of someone else's house at 3 a.m. Very useful in divorce cases. Nobody was thinking about this when you were putting Google Maps down on your phone. But go back into your Google Maps tonight, click on History, and it will show you where you've been for the past 3 months. I know you're all about to run out the door and delete this stuff, right? So we do this unintentionally. We don't need to have a government seeking to go control us for this to have a significant effect on our lives.
Okay, so I've been given the notice that we have time for 2 more questions. I apologize that I cannot get to all of the good questions here. The second to last question will be, how does Israel deter cyber attacks? How is it different than the United States?
Well, they've got something called Unit 8200, which is their equivalent of the NSA. They identify young students to go into the unit early on, and as soon as they come out of 8200, they've all been starting up cybersecurity firms. And it's impressive, and they do a good job, but it's also a little bit of Israeli spin out here. They don't have an economy or the kind of targets that we do. And so while they suffer from these, they're better protected at it, they've got a more disciplined population. The problem just isn't the same size as it is here.
Okay, so for the last question, I'm actually going to combine 2 that focus on the Trump administration's response to this. You can answer both or choose the one that you prefer. One question is, the Trump White House removed its cybersecurity chief because it said the work was being done elsewhere. Where? And the other question is, would you anticipate the response that you would like to see from the Trump administration happening so long as this is all intertwined with Russian involvement in the 2016 election?
Sure. So on the first question, you're absolutely right. They said it was being done elsewhere, that everybody was responsible for cybersecurity. And my experience in government is that when everybody is responsible for something, no one is responsible for it. They actually got off to a good start in the Trump administration on this. They had 2 people, a Homeland Security advisor and a cybersecurity coordinator who knew what they were doing. The cybersecurity coordinator used to run the Tailored Access Operations Unit of the NSA. That's the group that breaks into foreign computer systems. That's who you want doing your domestic protection. Just like you want Willie Sutton protecting banks. They know how this is done, okay? So getting rid of them, which had more to do with the internal politics of John Bolton taking over the NSC, was, I think, a big step backward. Sorry, the second question you were asking,
The
Abby?
second question was, would you expect to see the response from the Trump administration that you would hope to see so long as this whole question is tied into the 2016 election?
No, and that's part of the big problem here. In an ideal world, President Trump, the day after he was inaugurated, would have said, my fellow Americans, I believe I was legitimately elected. There's no evidence that the Russians actually tampered with the election results. They may have done some ads like this. But the fact of the matter is they tried. We had interference in the election. We can't have that in America. So I'm starting up a 9/11 style commission, and we're going to go figure out what they did, come out with lessons learned. The first report will be before the midterm elections, so we can do the easy seal-ups. But certainly by the 2020 election, we want to make sure we've redesigned our system so this can't happen. And that we've looked at our voting machines so that everything's got paper backup. And that we've looked at our ad practices so we know at least where ads are coming from. That speech never happened. And that's a big problem. So I thank you all very much.
Well,
Thank you, Abby.
One quick announcement. Please remember that books are available up here, and Mr. Sanger will be staying for a book signing.
And I'll also answer any questions that didn't get answered.
Exactly. So would you join me again in thanking Mr. Sanger?
Thank you.